Can start now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ به من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So inshallah we'll be starting a series of lectures on the fifth Sunni legal school of thought, which is known as the Zahiri school. And there is an interesting parallel between the Zahiri school of more than 1,000 years ago and the Ahlul Hadith of today. It's simply an academic study. There'll be a lot of technical detail in this lecture, so please bear with me. So Zahiri school of thought is known as the fifth valid Sunni school of juristic thought after the Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Hanbali. There were other madahib as well, including the madhab of Sufyan Thawri, Imam Abu Thawr, Imam Jafar al-Tabari, but they all became extinct. The Zahiri school of thought also seemed to go out of fashion, but then it was revived by Ibn Hazm, and subsequently Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, Imam al-Shawkani, and the Ahlul Hadith of today also have had leaning towards this school of thought or the methodology of the school of thought, as we shall see. It is known for its heavy reliance on the manifest meaning of the text of the Holy Quran and the Hadith, which means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the mutakallim. Quran is kalamullah, so Allah is the speaker. The words of the Quran are the text, and people are the readers. Similarly, when it comes to hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the speaker, and his words and his actions have been communicated to us by Sahaba and their students and so on and so forth until today, and we read those ahadith or we listen to those ahadith. The text of the Quran as well as the text of the hadith is composed of words, and words have a meaning, and we should go with the most common meaning of the words rather than try to find out the hidden meanings or alternative meanings. This madhab was established by Dawud al-Zahiri in the 3rd century. It became defunct, but interest in it was revived by Imam Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi in the 5th century after Hijrah. And there has been an increased interest in modern time in the methodology of this school, and books have been written by scholars such as Ignaz Gold-Zahir, who was an Austrian scholar of Islam. Amr Usman has also written a book as a part of the Studies in Islamic Law and Society series, and other books on hadith studies written by contemporary scholars have also devoted considerable part of their books, of their writings, to the Zahiri school of thought. The problem of modern Western scholarship when it comes to the Zahiri madhab can be summarized as follows: that the first Western scholar who wrote on the Zahiri madhab was Ignaz Gold-Zahir. He passed away in 1921. He was a Hungarian, I said Austrian, but he was a Hungarian scholar of Islam. He has written several books, including Muslim studies. He gave several lectures on Islam. And he is actually have told some of his students that I love Muslims. He wrote a book, The Zahiris, Their Doctrine and Their History. He showed interest in the history of the Zahiris, but later scholars focused more on Ibn Hazm, if not exclusively, and much less on the founder of the school, Dawud al-Zahiri. In today's talk, I will be focusing mainly on Dawud al-Zahiri, rahmahullah. There will be one or maybe two lectures on Ibn Hazm, inshallah. So who was Dawud al-Zahiri, who was the founder of the Zahiri school of Islamic jurisprudence? There are quite a few contradicting statements by his early biographers, so it's kind of hard to say anything with any amount of certainty about his birth, about the place of his birth. It is mentioned that he was born either in the year 200 or 202, which is close to the birth of Imam al-Bukhari. Imam al-Shafi'i was alive at that time, but Dawud al-Zahiri was only 2 years or 4 years old when Imam Shafi'i passed away. So he cannot be considered to be a direct student of Imam Shafi'i, although some biographers have mentioned it. Khatib al-Baghdadi, in his book Tarikh Baghdad, mentioned that Dawud lived most of his life in Baghdad, but he does not mention where he was born. Another biographer, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, who was born in Kufa, who mentioned that as Dawud al-Zahiri was born in Kufa and grew up in Baghdad. Al-Sam'ani mentioned that Zahiri was born in Kashan near Isfahan and then resided in Baghdad. He was also known as Dawud al-Isfahani. Now, just as an interesting aside, I must mention that Dawud al-Zahiri was very, very impressed by Imam al-Shafi'i, and he actually has written a book about the biography of Imam al-Shafi'i. The only reference we find about his family and early life is that his father was a scribe of a certain Abdullah ibn Khalid al-Kufi, who was the judge of Isfahan during the times of Al-Ma'mun. It is also mentioned that perhaps his mother was, or not perhaps, but most likely his mother was a Persian. His father followed the Hanafi school of law, but Dawud al-Zahiri did not. We do not know for sure what he did for a living, except from an isolated and rather ambiguous account that he may have worked as a judge for some time. He grew up during the last years of the Inquisition or the Mehna during the Abbasid period on the issue of the createdness of Quran. We discussed that issue in detail when we discussed the life and works of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But Dawud himself does not seem to have subscribed to the official position at that time. And we also don't know much about his relationship with the caliphs, the Abbasid caliphs, indicating that he was not a particularly notable scholar during his life, although he did have interaction with Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was a contemporary of his. There's also uncertainty about the year and the place of his death. The year that is usually mentioned as the year of his death is 270 after the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, corresponding to the year 884 of the current era. It is mentioned that he was buried in Baghdad, but exactly where it is not known. There are no details about his funeral, and this is surprising given the fact that historians and biographers give graphic details of the last rites of the funeral rites of the major scholars, mentioning how people cried and how hundreds of thousands of people gathered to offer their funeral prayers and so on and so forth. We don't find much about al-Zahiri. A possible explanation is that since most of his teachers were either Basran from Basra or by birth or residents of Basra, it is possible that Dawud al-Zahiri was born in Kufa. He then traveled to Basra at an early age, and then possibly to the east where he may have met Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, settling down in Baghdad later on. Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, as we have seen before, was one of the most prominent students of Imam al-Shafi'i, and there are some munazarat or heated discussions between al-Zahiri and Ishaq ibn Rahawayh as well. Now, Siyar Alamun Nubala is a book that I frequently refer to. It's like an encyclopedia of Islamic scholars. And he has mentioned Dawud al-Zahiri in his book, writing only a few pages about him, and really not much about his work. So some of the things that he mentions about him is that Muhammad bin Dawud ibn Ali al-Zahiri. Al-Allama, he was a scholar. Al-Bare, he was like a genius. Zul Funun, he was master of many arts. And Fakana Ahadum Mayudrabul Mathal Bizakaihi. Example was given of his intellect. So people would say you are as intelligent as Muhammad bin Dawud. And he wrote a book, Az-Zahra fil Ada wa Sher. He also wrote a book, Kitab fil Faraid, which is about the laws of inheritance, wa ghair zalika, and others. There is a compendium of like almost all the books or most of the books written in Islamic history by Ibn Nu'aym is known as Al-Fahrist, the list, the most comprehensive list, which mentions several books written by Dawud al-Zahiri or attributed to Dawud al-Zahiri, but it seems like none of these books have survived except the references from that. And he said, well, Lahu Basarun Tam bil Hadith. He had a great insight in Hadith. Wa bi aqwali Sahaba. He was very familiar with the statements of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. Wa kana yajtahidu. He was a mujtahid. Wala yuqallidu ahadan. And he was not a blind follower of anyone. So this is just some excerpts. There are other scholars and biographers or writers of other books who do mention Dawud al-Zahiri, and some of the prominent mentions are like this: that Al-Shirazi mentioned that the mastership of knowledge in Baghdad culminated in Dawud al-Zahiri. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi: Dawud was Imam al-Zahir. Ibn Khalid Khan: Dawud was a scholar with an independent madhab that was followed by a large group of people called al-Zahiriya. So at some point in time, his madhab must have been widely practiced and must have had a large number of followers. His circle was attended by about 400 people wearing talisan, which is a round green garment with no bottom, and it was worn on the shoulders. It is mentioned that Imam at-Tabri also attended his sessions. So if we read about the life stories of these imams, we find that there are many points of meeting of these imams. They either met with each other, they learned from each other, or they had students which served as links between them. His education: he studied under a number of notable scholars like Imam Abu Thawr. In fact, Abu Thawr seems to have had a lot of influence upon him. Yahya ibn Ma'in, one of the teachers of Imam al-Bukhari, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He then traveled to Nishapur, and this is a recurrent theme when we read the books about our earlier scholars, that they traveled in search of knowledge. Wherever they could find somebody who was knowledgeable, they would travel to learn from them. So he then studied under Imam Ishaq ibn Rahway, but he would debate with his own teacher. And we have seen that in the case of Imam Shafi'i as well, that he studied under Imam Malik, but he would discuss and debate with Imam Malik. Similarly, Imam Shafi'i studied under Imam Hassan al-Shaybani al-Hanafi, and he would have discussions and debates with the Imam as well, and oftentimes disagree with his views. Now, it is mentioned that during one session, Imam Rahway criticized Imam al-Shafi'i. Now, Imam Rahway was one of the most prominent students of Imam al-Shafi'i, but he could also criticize. And Dawud al-Zahiri told him that Rahway did not understand Imam al-Shafi'i's point on that particular issue. Now, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was also present in that session. So Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal learned from Imam Shafi'i, but also from Ishaq Rahway. And Imam Ishaq Rahway learned from Imam Shafi'i. And Dawud also learned from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Imam Ishaq Rahway. And he actually liked Imam Shafi'i more. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal declares that Imam Ishaq Rahway was the winner of that discussion. So as I mentioned that Dawud al-Zahiri's father was Hanafi, but Dawud himself was initially a follower of the Shafi'i madhab. Now that Imam Dawud, the teacher, they are first students, then they become teachers. So it is mentioned that he returned to Baghdad after completing his education, and he started his own school, started teaching. His reputation is spread outside of Baghdad, and even high-level scholars from elsewhere would come to him seeking his advice on religious topics. Just as he was traveling to learn from other scholars, now others were coming to learn from him. And among his prominent students are his own son, Ibn Dawud, and we'll talk about him, inshallah, in the next lecture. Muhammad Abdullah, who was a son, the son's name was Muhammad. Then Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's son, Abdullah, was also one of the students of Dawud al-Zahiri. Imam at-Tabri, as I mentioned, attended his lectures. And one of his students, Abdullah al-Qaisi, was responsible for spreading the Zahiri school in Al-Andalus in Spain. And it is where that a couple of centuries later, one of the most towering scholars of Islam, Imam Ibn Hazm, was born. And then he continued the work of the Zahiri school. And inshallah, we'll be devoting at least one session on Ibn Hazm. Now, Dawud was not considered to be a hadith transmitter. And if we compare his career with the other leading scholars of his era, it appears that he was closer in profile to scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i, rather than to a scholar like Ahmad ibn Hanbal or other hadith transmitters or critics. Similar to him, Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i to some extent were not distinguished as hadith transmitters, and they were better known for their engagement in argumentation. Now, the Hanafi scholars will tell us that This is not the case. Imam Abu Hanifa had a large number of ahadith, and those were actually compiled in several books, including Kitabul Asar, Musnad Imam Abu Hanifa, and Musnad Imam Azam. There are other books as well. And in the writings of the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Hassan al-Shaybani, who has written 6 leading books of Hanafi fiqh, very early books of Hanafi fiqh, it is mentioned, and I have not read all of those 6 books, that there are at least or close to 40,000 ahadith in those 6 books. Imam Shafi'i also is reported to have a Musnad Imam Shafi'i in which he had collected his hadith. But primarily, both Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i was known as fuqaha, rather than scholars of hadith. On the other hand, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, as we have discussed, was better known as a hadith scholar rather than a faqih in his time. Now, it is not uncommon for medieval legal works to report Dawud's views either as a source of further support for a particular legal view or as a target of refutation and even ridicule. So this happens, and this has happened to other scholars as well, that there are those who extol the qualities of their teacher, and there are those who criticize him, who refute his views, or even ridicule it. And the same has happened to Imam Abu Hanifa as well. And more often than not, these sources do not mention the basis on which Dawud held those views. The same is true for Imam Abu Hanifa, where he gets criticized, but people don't exactly mention what was the basis of that criticism. The problem is further compounded by the fact that we do not possess any of Imam Dawud al-Zahiri's legal works or any legal work from his immediate students until the time of Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi, who was writing almost 2 centuries after Imam Dawud al-Zahiri's death and thousands of miles away from the birthplace of the Zahirism, the Zahiri school of thought. He compiled extensive works of Zahiri legal theory, sources, and methodology, including Usul al-Fiqh and substantive views or furu. But how representative Ibn Hazm is of Dawud's legal heritage is a question that requires much deeper study. Now, I want to walk you through some of the things that we have covered in the previous lectures, which will refresh our memory and at the same time help us in understanding Imam Dawud al-Zahiri's point of view. Although, as I mentioned, we do not have his own books to help us understand, but we can try to understand by comparing some of the works that he did with what the other schools of thought had done. So now, there were 2 types of schools of thought in those days. One, as I mentioned, were Ahlul Hadith. The other group was Ahlul Rai. And there is often a confusion how to define people of opinion and people of Hadith, when we know that people of opinion also used Hadith, and we know that people of Hadith also use legal or legalistic juristic reasoning, which falls into the category of Rai. So these were the 2 branches of legal scholars who were occupied with the investigation of Islamic law that eventually led to the formation of the major Islamic madahib or schools of jurisprudence. I must mention that Imam Malik did not establish Maliki madhab, Imam Shafi'i did not establish Shafi'i madhab, or Imam Abu Hanifa did not establish Hanafi madhab. The structure or the basic formation of these madhib started with these scholars, but they themselves did not put rigid boundaries. They all left the door for ijtihad open. They also mentioned that what I am saying today may not be what I will say tomorrow. I may change my opinion tomorrow. And if you find an authentic hadith, then that will be my madhab. But again, unfortunately, as time passed on, their students also started to establish further schools, further madaris, and eventually it led to the formation of several schools of Islamic jurisprudence, of which 5 in the Sunni and Jafari in the Shia jurisprudence have survived as far as the majority is concerned. Now, the people of Hadith were concerned with the study of transmitted sources, the Hadith, and the statements and opinions of the companions Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. But again, I must say the people of opinion also knew about these and incorporated them in their fatwa. The people of opinion, or Ahlul Rai, were concerned more with the practical aspects of law and used other methods as well, such as ijtihad, qiyas or analogical reasoning, istihsan, that if they have more than one opinion, they will choose the one which appeared to them to be better, and public interest, etc. The difference between the two branches. In the earliest stages of their evolution, the two branches differed from each other in the extent to which they permitted rai or juristic opinion to be a determining factor in deriving legal rulings. As I mentioned, that the two groups are not completely mutually exclusive. Now, on the one extreme, we have Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Dawud al-Zahiri, who made considerable use of juristic opinion. The other refuted the use of opinion and dependent entirely on the transmitted reports. Now, this might sound paradoxical that if Dawud al-Zahiri was going with the manifest meaning of the text of Quran and the Hadith, how can we say that he used opinion? And the thing is that when you read any statement, be it poetry, be it a prose, you look at the words and you form an opinion of what those words actually mean. And you may be absolutely convinced that this is exactly what the words mean linguistically, but actually, this is your opinion. So, again, it's a gray zone between the two schools, but it is mentioned by modern scholarship as well as earlier scholarship that Dawud al-Zahiri also used his opinion in such matters in defining or determining the meaning of the text. Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal took the middle position. So they were not extremists because all of them were men of intellect. They did use their opinion. They also used all other methods of juristic reasoning that I mentioned earlier when no text was present, or if there was more than one opinion, then they definitely used the intellectual reasoning as well. So who established the five Sunni madhab? Not the leading figures, as I mentioned, such as Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or anyone, Imam Dawud al-Zahiri, rahmahullah alayhim. It's the subsequent scholars who were either direct students or students of students who followed the methodology of these pioneers. They compiled their juristic verdicts. As I mentioned, that Muhammad Hassan al-Shaybani compiled 6 books based upon the juristic verdicts of Imam Abu Hanifa and his students. And eventually, separate schools of legal thought emerged, and people became compartmentalized. That if you are a Hanafi, you must follow only the Hanafi laws and not move back and forth between other madhab, although there's a lot of debate about it. Ibn Khaldun, however, places Dawud al-Zahiri at the top of a third class. So he considers him not to be completely from the category of Ahlul Hadith or from the category of Ahlul Rai, but a third class in itself, and he was like the pioneer of that class. So why is there a need for the use of Rai or opinion? Al-Shahrastani, I've referred to him before as well, he mentioned that written texts are limited. The Quran is completed. Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum wa atmamtu alaykum ni'mati wa raditu lakum al-Islam adina. Nothing else can be added to the Quran. Similarly, after the death of Imam Bayhaqi in the 5th century, it is mentioned that no new hadith has been discovered. So all the hadiths that have been in circulation, be it authentic, daif, hasan, fabricated, they all had been studied, that all had been verified and compiled, and no new hadith has come on the surface since Imam al-Bayhaqi passed away. So we have the Quran text with 114 surahs, it's limited. We have a large number of ahadiths, but it's still limited. So going back to Asharastani's statement, written texts are limited, but the incidents of daily life are unlimited. And that it is impossible for something infinite to be closed by something finite. And the Prophet ﷺ himself left this door open in the very famous hadith of Mu'adh ibn Jabal, that what if you don't find something either in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, what would you do? So that door was left open by the Prophet ﷺ himself, indicating that as time goes on, newer issues will come to the surface for which you may not find any direct text in the Quran or the Hadith. And what should you do in that situation? And as Mu'adh ibn Jabal said, Ajtahidu bi rai, I will use my rai. And the Prophet ﷺ actually complimented him and thanked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are other opinions as well. So another opinion with respect to rai is الراي بمنزلة الميتة إذا اضطررت إليها أكلتها. The rye is like a carcass, a dead animal, you can say. It is used as food in an extreme emergency only. This statement comes from Ash-Shabi. Scholars have used weak traditions if no stronger tradition was to be found in a particular issue. So now this is an issue that if you do not have a verse in the Quran related to a particular issue, and there is no strong, authentic hadith, but there is a weak hadith, what should you do? And as I mentioned in our sessions on Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that he would prefer to use a weak hadith rather than use his own reasoning. Now, there is something interesting that has been mentioned, that many a fabrication of traditions might have its origin in this fundamental endeavor to shun Rai, at least ostensibly for as long as possible. Yet those fabricated quotations from traditions were nothing but Rai clothed in traditions. It's an opinion of Ignaz Zahir. What he's trying to say is that if people are following a certain way in a certain action, and somebody questioned them, what is the dalil? Where did you find it? If it's not in the Quran, if it's not in the hadith, but the other group knows, then someone will say, this is the hadith. I'm acting according to that hadith. And we know when we study why hadiths were fabricated, we find that many times people will fabricate the hadith, and this comes from the fabricators themselves, that we do it only to motivate people. Okay, but those were fabrications. Secondly, people will strengthen the opinion of their madhab by coming up with the hadith, that this is the hadith based upon which we have a fatwa. And it becomes very tricky, it becomes very tough, and it requires really scholars. And our scholars have done a lot of work. And sometimes we find that somebody would say that, well, the Hanafi opinion in this issue is not authentic, it is not correct. Similarly, Hanafis will say the other opinion is not correct, but they wouldn't say that it is a fabrication. They will be very careful about it. So here what Zahiris is mentioning is that such ahadith are nothing but an opinion disguised as a tradition. And again, this is, as I said, it's a sore point. It's a difficult thing to understand. So we'll not spend much more time upon that. If those who are interested can actually read more on these issues. So what was Zahiris' approach? He completely rejected the justification of juristic opinion and analogical reasoning and focused on the apparent meaning of the text. So he actually went even beyond Imam Shafi'i, who had, and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal as well, when it came to qiyas or analogical reasoning. And it is mentioned that his starting point may have been a book reportedly written by Imam Shafi'i, Kitabul Hukm bil Zahir. So it's a book about giving religious verdicts according to the apparent meaning of the text. It is mentioned that Imam Shafi'i actually wrote this book. And Zahiri himself is not particularly regarded as a scholar of hadith. His aim, although molded by Shafi'i's initiative, was to go beyond by banning qiyas completely as one of the legitimate sources of canonical legal deduction. He also rejected taqlid, which is the unconditional following of the teachings of a certain imam or school of thought in issues that were not clearly explained in the valid legal sources. And according to Zahiri, the only valid legal sources were the Book of Allah and the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the consensus of the companions. We'll come to the last part as well. Now, Zahiri and taqlid. So some of the statements reported from him are that the indiscriminate imitation, which means the taqlid, the indiscriminate imitation of the teachings of a fallible person is objectionable and evidence of narrow-mindedness. What he's saying is that if you're following a certain madhab blindly while disregarding the other opinions, then it is an evidence of your narrow-mindedness. And he also mentioned, shame on anyone who's given a torch with which to illuminate his paths, but who blows it out to walk around supported by someone else. Again, blind following. Then he said, take the laws from where they themselves derive. Them means the scholars. To take the laws from where they themselves derive them, follow neither myself, nor Malik, Auzai, An-Nakhai, nor anyone else slavishly. In other words, there is no need to follow a human authority blindly if one can use the legal sources oneself. But as I mentioned earlier, not everybody is a mujtahid. Not everybody has the ability to study the Quran on his or her own without a teacher, or to study all the ahadiths, hundreds of thousands of ahadiths, and then decide how to pray. It's beyond anybody's capacity unless you just do it for one or two issues. And in doing so, he went over to a camp in which neither Ash-Shafi'i himself would have wanted to stand, nor his school. So he started as a follower of Imam Ash-Shafi'i, then he changed his path, and he went even beyond that school to a territory where even Imam Ash-Shafi'i would not want to enter. Now, what was Imam Zahiri's opinion about the consensus or ijma? He accepted only the consensus of the companions Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. He did not accept the consensus of the followers of the Tabi'in, because he said that the Sahaba were familiar with each other, they lived together, they had learned from the Prophet ﷺ directly from himself, and they were able to communicate with each other. So if there were differences of opinion, they would be more likely to resolve them. But the ijma of later generations, even the followers of the companions, was irrelevant according to Zahiri, because he said, how could one ascertain that they all agreed with each other, given the fact that they were separated from each other geographically, and there was no way of knowing the opinion of each and every scholar. And inshallah, at some point, I will give a talk about ijma and what are the different types of ijma, including ijma qali, ijma amali or ijma feli, and ijma sukuti. And Zahiri rejected ijma sukuti as Imam Shafi'i had done, the ijma by silence. But Zahiri had a limitation. And it was one thing to insist on the exclusive right of scripture and tradition, but quite another to reject analogy and juristic opinion completely, because legal practice always had to take recourse to other sources when written and orally transmitted sources did not provide a direct answer to an issue. And I quoted the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and in another opinion as well, that why Rai is important. Now, Zahiri was himself obliged to apply analogical reasoning and to recognize it as evidence, but he did not call it qiyas. He used a different term for it, which was dalil. So, وَكَانَ دَاوُدْ لَا يَرَى الْقِيَاسِ فِي الشَّرِيعَةِ. Dawud did not admit of analogical reasoning or qiyas in the Sharia. ثُمَّ اسْتُرَّ إِلَيْهِ فَسَمَّهُ dalil. But if he was forced, because there was no text, then he used his reasoning, his rai, but he called it a dalil. So he used qiyas only as a last resort. The later followers like Ibn Hazm retracted the concession of calling it dalil. So they went totally against that. Now I'll give you a simplified overview of the madahib that we have been studying. We have studied the life history and the life and the works of five scholars: Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and Imam Jafar, as well as we have also studied the history and evolution of the Islamic fiqh, where these issues were mentioned repeatedly. But I want to give you a simplified overview of these Sunni madhab. That Imam Malik preferred the practice of the people of Medina, Ta'amul Alul Medina. Imam Abu Hanifa and the people of Rai, Ahlul Rai, Imam Abu Hanifa was not the only one. They accepted the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet. They did not reject the Hadith. This is something very important to understand. But they upheld the conclusions of their own methods of reasoning when faced with apparently contradictory ahadith. So if you have one hadith in which a person mentioned that the Prophet said that if you touch your private part, the wudu is broken, and then another hadith where the Prophet said, how can it be broken when it is part of your own body? Now what do? Which hadith do you prefer? So this is where the Hanafis went with the intellectual reasoning. The Ahlul Hadith went with what they would consider to be a more authentic hadith. And again, there are issues with that. Now, there was also another group of people known as Ahlul Kalam, Mutakallimin. They took a more radical approach. They rejected the authority of hadith altogether. Now, this is not a simple thing to understand, so let me go on further in explaining it. They insisted on the hadith being supported by the Quran. So if there was a hadith, they would insist that they will accept the hadith if it was supported by the Quran. They rejected a hadith if there was even a little doubt about its authenticity, and they were reluctant to accept any extra Quranic evidence for legal issues dealt with in the Quran, and tended to regard questions not referred to the in the Quran as having been left deliberately unregulated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What they mean is that if there is no direct command or Quran does not give a definitive answer to a particular issue, then it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deliberately left it open so that people could use their own judgment, their own opinion, according to the time, according to the conditions, and come up with an answer in that sense. They did not argue that the prophetic example, Sunnah, is not authoritative. So again, they did not reject the authority of the Sunnah. But what they argued was that Hadith does not accurately reflect this example, and that the true legacy of the Holy Prophet ﷺ is to be found first and foremost in following the Quran, because the Prophet ﷺ was kana khuluquhul Quran. His entire character was the Quran, and the Quran also mentions Mama yantaku anil hawa in huwa illa wahyun yuha. So they gave that explanation that the true legacy of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, the true way of following the Sunnah, will be by following the Quran. Now, Ahlul Rai also did not reject the authority of the Prophet ﷺ in theory. Okay, they questioned whether the Hadith reports were the best representation of the authority, because the Hadith came through a chain, a long chain. There are contradictory Hadiths. The words of the Hadiths are also different, reported by different Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajmain. And the practice of the people of Medina may be different, as we have seen in the case of Imam Malik's Mawatta. They were not fighting over whether to follow the Prophet ﷺ, but rather how to follow him. And this is something very important, which unfortunately many of the new Google scholars do not really understand when they start to criticize one madhab or the other and promote one madhab over the other. All Sunni madhab, all these imams were not fighting or arguing whether to follow the Prophet ﷺ. Everybody wants to follow the Prophet ﷺ. He is a role model for us. But the question is how to follow him and how to determine that a hadith reported from him was really representative of how he conducted himself. The Zahiris in this way were midway between the people of hadith and the people of opinion. As I mentioned, Ibn Khaldun puts Imam Dawud al-Zahiri in the third category. Now, Ahlul Hadith, if we look at those the five madhab, Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal represent the Ahlul Hadith category. Imam Shafi'i insisted on the hadith narrated through the text and not just through the amal bit tawatur as Imam Malik did. So there was a difference of opinion between Imam Shafi'i and Imam Malik. And Imam Malik, when Imam Shafi'i was arguing with him, told him, Alfu min alfin khairu min wahid min wahid. 1,000 from 1,000 is better than 1 from 1. Which means if thousands of people are acting in a particular way, then it is better than one written text. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal would use even a weak hadith rather than rely upon his reasoning. But Zahiris almost rejected analogical reasoning and preferred the apparent meaning of the text of the Quran and the hadith. The Ahlul Hadith established that hadith had legislative authority independent of the Quran. And they gave several examples, and I'll just mention a couple. First is the very famous verse in the Quran, which comes several places, but I will just quote from Al Imran, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِنْ أَنْفُسِهِمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَإِنْ كَانُوا مِنْ قَبْلُ لَفِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown kindness to the believers when He sent from among them a messenger who would recite to them Allah's verses, purify them, teach them the book and hikmah, while they were before that in manifest deviation. Now, Imam Shafi explained the word al-hikmah like this: al-hikmah hiya sunnah. That the hikmah is represented by the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the sunnah obviously will contain the hadith. So here is the legislative role of the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For Imam Shafi, this was in a text, hadith with the text. It is also mentioned that Jibril alayhi salatu wasalam used to descend to the Holy Prophet sallam with sunnah, just as he descended with the Quran. And this is the concept of wahi matlu and ghair matlu. Wahi matlu is the wahi which is recited in the form of the Quran, and ghair matlu is, you can say, the hadith Qudsi or other hadiths which are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but which are not part of the Quran. Now, they also mentioned that having commanded the believers to obey the Holy Prophet, Atiullah wa Atiur Rasul, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have provided the means to do so, that is through the hadith. And the Quran also, Surah Najm mentioned, وَمَا يَنْتَقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَىٰ. Shadidul Quwa is referred to as Jibril, it's a reference to Jibril, that the Prophet does not say anything out of his own hawa, out of his own desires. And scholars explain in the matters of religion, except that it is wahi, which has been revealed to him, and he has been taught by the Shadidul Quwa, the one who has strength, Jibril alayhi salatu wasalam. So again, this can be explained that Jibril alayhi salatu wasalam would teach the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam outside of the Quranic revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are two famous statements made by defenders of hadith, that the Sunnah rules on the Quran, but the Quran does not rule on the Sunnah. And the Quran has greater need of the Sunnah than the Sunnah of the Quran. Al-Zahiris made imitation of the Holy Prophet ﷺ in every detail a matter of legal obligation. Now, it is mentioned that the Ahlul Hadith of today are the Zahiris of the past, and there are many similarities between them. This comes from a book written by, let me just find out. There is a book written by Daniel Brown, Rethinking Tradition in Modern Islamic Thought, where he gives a comparative account of the methodology of Ahlul Hadith of today and the Zahiris of the past. And he said they both rejected taqlid. They both employed extreme literalism in approach to Hadith. They bind themselves to a single literal meaning of the text of the Quran and the Hadith, denying the efficacy of qiyas. They refuse to acknowledge any authority in the orthodox schools of law, whether in matters of detail or theory or the usul. So we'll end this lecture today. Inshallah, we'll continue with the Zahiri madhab next week as well and focus more on Ibn Hazm. And I know it's a difficult topic to understand, but for those who are interested in studying hadith at an intellectual basis, I'm sure it will be helpful, but do your own reading. There are very few books now on the Zahiri madhab, but they are of a very high class, and you will enjoy if you want to really need it. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولذكر الله أكبر. صلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.